Welcome to State of the State. I'm Darlene DeRezzo, and I'm in conversation with David Segal. He is vying for Jim Langevin's position. Jim is retiring. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah,
okay.
Yes, you may.
All right, so you are not a native Rhode Islander.
It's true.
What brought you to Rhode Island?
I just moved up after college. I had a lot of friends here and wanted to find my way, and suppose in many respects I did. I got involved in politics. This was like 2001 is when I moved to town, so now literally exactly half a lifetime ago. And I got involved in just political organizing work very quickly, which sort of put me on the path that I'm still on today.
Okay, so you came up in 2001, no family, some friends, so you had some roots. And what was your first position here? You said politics? I
was doing things like just tutoring math, for instance. I studied math as an undergrad, and then pretty quickly, within a year, I was running for the city council in Providence and won that race in 2002.
What inspired you to do that?
So I was part of two different movements that were the predominant ones in the city at the time. I would say one was for fairer wages for city workers. We were pushing for an ordinance that would say that people worked for the city or for big contractors or entities that were getting tax breaks from the city had to make a living wage, which at the time I think was a little bit over $10 an hour. And the other was for police reforms. This was right as Buddy was leaving office, and there was
who was sorry?
Right as Buddy was leaving as mayor of Providence, and there was a broad movement in furtherance of a civilian review board to play a role in adjudicating accusations of improprieties. And both of those movements were really inspiring to me and to hundreds or thousands of others across the city. And I ended up running for office against an old ward machine that was not on my side of either of those issues, and was able to win and served on the city council for 4 years, made some progress on those fronts and many others, environmentalism, civil liberties and otherwise. And then I served in the assembly for 4 years, where I co-organized our progressive caucus and worked again on similar issues, on trying to push back against corporate power and on fairer taxes, on ensuring that city and town budgets were maintained. This was during the fiscal crisis, for instance, environmentalism, and then moved on, and for the past 10 years or so have been running a national nonprofit. I'm on leave from it right now, but again, where the thrust of the work has been pushing back against the role that corporate special interests and political corruption play in our system, and trying to build broad coalitions that can overcome them and get things done for everyday people here and across the whole country.
Okay, so tell me about some of those initial victories. You said when you first entered office.
Yeah, so
you had a very specific agenda.
Yep. And so there were the thrust of like the living wage work, the fair wage work, was part increasing wages for folks, part more equitable development. So saying that people who were developing in the city with public subsidy would have to hire local people in order to do the work of the project, and to try to increase the extent to which they made use of unionized labor. And as with like any movement, you win some aspects of a fight, or hopefully you win some aspects of a fight. It's rare that you win on every single point, and that's sort of been the case for that arc of work. We were able to make some progress on the local hiring elements of it. We were able to get more funding for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in the city, which I helped start back then. And over the years since, that movement has continued, with a lot of work carried forth by a person who's now on the city council, whose campaign I helped manage 4 years ago. Rachel Miller helped bring a lot of that work to fruition last year. We were able to make Providence, I think, the first capital city in the country to have a renewable energy mandate. We did work to help custodians organize, hotel workers organize, prevent workplace abuses, and on. And then in the assembly, the things that come top of mind are I oversaw the passage of legislation 3 years in a row to expand the ability of people to put up wind turbines or solar panels. So the wind turbines at Fields Point in Providence, now part of the Skyline, those were a direct consequence of legislation that I helped pass, or that I was the lead sponsor of. And a lot of my work during that era was about guarding cities and towns from budget cuts. The cities and towns are really contingent upon the state for their funding. And I was in office during a period when there was a lot of chaos when it came to the budget. It was during the fiscal crisis. And we had pretty conservative assembly leadership. We had a right-wing governor. We had Don Carcieri as the governor. And as part of dealing with that crisis, they looked, right away to cuts for cities and towns, especially the poorer urban core cities and towns, and building a coalition of people who weren't just like me necessarily, reps from not just Providence, but also Johnston and Cranston and other parts of the state, to come together and help block those cuts, or some of those cuts, I should say. We did not win on all of them, but we were able to make a big difference during an era where every dollar mattered. Was a moment that I look back upon with very favorably. I'm very happy that I was able to be part of that work because I think it made a difference.
Okay, so you mentioned living wage, right? So, and that is one of the issues that you are running on now. Expand on that.
Yeah, and I'm running, again, broadly speaking, about pushing back against corporate special interests and their power over our system. And one aspect of their power over our system is suppressing the wages of workers. And there are various ways to get at this. I support a $15 minimum wage indexed to inflation. And that might be higher if we don't move pretty quickly on that at the federal level. We need to make it easier to form unions. Unions are one of the forces that makes it that creates a more equal society in the economic realm, and then after that in the political realm. And we need to be looking at a variety of different social programs, and we need to push back against corporate monopolies that we've allowed to form over the course of the last 70, 40 years, but in a way that's accelerated over the course of recent decades, because they're in a position to extract money from consumers and small businesses and workers. So we need to restructure the system in a whole variety of ways to make it fair. Those are a few elements, but there are many others.
Do you see any cons to a $15 living wage?
I do not. I think that it's imperative.
Well, some would say there are cons, though, right? So there's a lot to consider. Skilled workers might be vying for those jobs, or workers with more education, right? Because maybe they don't want to go into the corporate world when you can have a $15 an hour job and not deal with some of the stressors. So there might be actually a market or a demographic that is eased out with a $15 an hour or whatever it is, living wage.
I don't know if I fully absorbed the question.
Businesses could send work overseas. That's happened.
Oh, well, that's a function of, right. So, outsourcing is also a policy decision that we've made.
Well, maybe that is something that you can expand upon. So a lot of outsourcing, why not create more jobs here?
Right.
Do you know what our unemployment rate is in Rhode Island?
I think we're at just around 3% right now.
And do you know what the national average is?
A little bit higher than that.
Okay.
But though we are just now recovering to pre-pandemic levels of employment, and unemployment is a function of people who are looking for work, and various people drop out of the workforce and all of that stuff. But the question was outsourcing, right? I think,
or outsourcing, but why not bring more jobs here? Right?
Yeah. So I think that we've created, and this goes back to what I was saying at the outset, we've created a trade regime across the world that's been construed to benefit these major corporations, some domestic, some foreign, and many international. And these are decisions that we made, that policymakers made, purporting to be working on our behalf. And there have not been wage standards, labor standards, human rights standards, environmental standards that are sufficient in many of those deals.
Some companies do go overseas, because overseas you're not going to have the same labor standards or the same environmental standards. We do have some very strict policies, laws, and rules here regarding that. So it's just something to consider.
Right. No, I think we definitely need to consider it, but I think the way we rectify it is by only being party to trade deals that make a point of enshrining those standards across the globe, or across parties that are parties to that trade deal. But I think that it's been shown that raising wages, especially if you're doing it at the national level, is likely to increase consumption in a way that means that you don't, on the whole, have businesses that end up going out of business.
You don't think that some small businesses may then cut their workforce, may have to
I think that on the whole, the economy...
reduce how many But as a small business owner, talk to small business owners. Hear what they are going to say about how that is going to impact the functioning of their business. How are they going to pay the workers
I think
that
that
they have?
what one finds is that when you raise wages, when you raise a minimum wage floor for the entirety of the country or for a large population, you end up with more economic activity generally in a way that, on average, means that businesses do just as well or somewhat better than they did before. There are always going to be vicissitudes at the margins, and we need to do other things to make it easier for small businesses to survive.
Let me give you an
for
example.
instance, I'm going to finish responding to your question. And so there are a whole bunch of different reasons why small businesses have trouble right now, and I think that we should focus on the ones that are more likely, that in dealing with, are more likely to yield a fairer economy. So we have banks that have aggregated over the course of the many decades. Local banking is almost not a thing anymore. It's harder for people to get loans than it used to be. Entrepreneurship is down substantially over the course of the last 50 years or so, for, among other reasons, decreased access to capital. We have monopolies that are operating across the country as a whole, like entities like Amazon, that are able to undercut the business of small businesses. And this is part of Amazon's strategy, quite specifically. They accumulate a lot of money through certain aspects of their business model, and they dump that into loss leading, into lowering prices so they can undercut potential competitors. They also have ways of manipulating the online platform in a way that undermines certain businesses and favors certain businesses, and particularly favors Amazon's own products. Mm-hmm. So I want to do things like increase access to capital for small businesses. I want to do things like decrease the rate of extraction.
I have to pause you because I don't want to run out of time. I'm going to give you an example. Mm-hmm. Let's say you are a mental health practitioner in private practice. You are dependent on insurance reimbursement. Mm-hmm. Okay, the insurance companies have decided they're going to pay you this much money to see this client. Now, I have a bookkeeper. I have an accountant. Let's say I now have to pay my bookkeeper twice as much, just an example, of what I'm paying that bookkeeper now. What happens to the way that I'm living? What happens to how I then conduct my business? What happens to, do I then have to stay up hours and hours doing my bookkeeping because I can't afford to pay someone else to do this work? Like, what happens to my quality of life?
So, I mean, respectfully, I don't know the book. I don't know your business. But
there's so many things to consider when
right, but one to consider is, so you're asking a tough question, and I'm going to interrogate the question. You said double the wages of your bookkeeper with a minimum wage increase.
Well, bookkeepers do make more than minimum wage and $15 an hour.
Yes.
Just an example.
Right,
but the receptionist.
Right, but you're not paying your receptionist $7.50 an hour right now because that's substantially below.
But if I were to pay a receptionist $15 an hour, for example, to answer the phone, then what happens again to my quality of life? What happens to the other people that are on my payroll? What happens to me trying to serve clients, for example? This is just one example. So just to consider what happens when we decide we're going to raise minimum wage.
Right, and on average, what happens when we raise a minimum wage is that people on the whole do better, especially more impoverished people, in a way that I should note. Poverty has substantial impacts on people's mental well-being, in addition to their ability to feed themselves, their families, all the physical aspects of their well-being. And
I don't want to stay on minimum wage because we have so much to talk about, but do you know why minimum wage was initially implemented and who and the workforce that was going into jobs at the minimum wage level?
I mean, it was, I would say disproportionately women were entering the workforce.
Nope. Okay, we will follow up on that. Let's move on because we see so many things to talk about. So you also talked about corporate interests, right? So why don't we talk about economic development? Mm-hmm. Okay, and in Rhode Island, you've been here a while, we have the Superman building. It's affectionately referred to as the Superman building. That has been vacant for quite some time. Mm-hmm. There was a plan to revitalize that fell through. Rhode Island has this image of being very unfriendly, right, to economic development. The stadium that was moved out of Pawtucket. into Massachusetts. So, Rhode Island's lost some opportunities for economic development and then potentially more jobs, potentially raising
Right.
Federal minimum wage, or actually minimum wage in the state and then maybe across the board to federal.
Well, right. Well, I'm talking about the federal minimum wage.
Yes.
Because as somebody.
We're at 15 minutes.
Okay.
See, we spend way too much time.
Okay. As somebody who's running for Congress, we'd be talking about raising the wage everywhere to $15 an hour, which would not. You can't argue capital flight from Rhode Island to Massachusetts based on a wage that's the same in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, for instance. You also earlier cited our unemployment rate, which I think is about 2.9% right now and is lower than the national average. So we need to be looking for ways to engage in economic development here, but in some respects.
And how? What would that look like, David?
So I have been. Well, what do you want a response to the Superman building?
I know.
Because
I've asked you so many questions. Okay.
These are all compound questions. The Superman building's my preferred way to deal with this is if the state's going to subsidize something, if the federal government's going to subsidize something, I think it should. In an ideal world, it takes partial ownership over that thing. I think we actually missed an opportunity to. I would have loved to have seen the state actually buy the Paw Sox back when. States are very good at running sports teams. They do it all the time through their universities and college systems, for instance. And we wouldn't then have had to deal with what I've been speaking to from the outset, corporations playing.
From to do that?
Well, it was only, I think the market price then was around $14 million. And so if you're concerned about, look at the subsidy. Who pays for that? But we would be taking ownership over it. We would literally be buying an asset in the same way that if we're going to subsidize the Superman building,
in the budget?
We should buy the asset and then you reap returns on an asset that you buy, right? That's a point of an investment.
Okay.
I think people understand the government should be able to buy assets and then reap the rewards from them. And the model that we've had otherwise is one where...
Or does that money trickle down to the people?
Well, through programs the government works or through other mechanisms, ideally it does. But the model that we've had, the alternative model that we've used for too long, and this is ubiquitous, it's not just a Rhode Island thing, is that we subsidize private entities that don't necessarily stick around, that make a handful of investors very wealthy, and that don't have the interests of everyday people in mind. And so if we're going to be engaging in subsidy of private developments at the federal level, or at the state level, or at the city level, in an ideal world, there's an ownership stake that comes with that, just as any other investor in that project expects to have an ownership stake in that project and see returns on it. That's what we should be expecting. That's what we should want public entities to do. And there's some movement here and there in this direction. It's not a ubiquitous practice, but I think it's the preferable one to just giving away the store or waiting, relying on the beneficence of a private entity that doesn't necessarily have your interests at heart. I mean, the Paw Sox ownership group went and played Rhode Island off of Massachusetts to try to extract more money from each. And then demonstrated how much loyalty they actually had to Pawtucket and to Rhode Island by upping going to Worcester. And this happens all over the country, and it's a really awful phenomenon that, again, the government could do something to change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what's next on the agenda? Protecting the environment. What do you want to say about that?
There, I would say, since I started in office, as I was speaking to earlier, this has been a priority for me, and I helped at the city level create a renewable energy mandate and create more energy efficiency programs and fuel efficiency programs at the state level. I, like I said, was the lead sponsor of legislation 3 years in a row to expand the ability of people and small businesses to put solar panels up or to put a wind turbine up. And helped defend renewable energy funding and got to vote for the Block Island wind turbine project. And you're talking about economic development. This is obviously a place where there's more potential for economic development here, and I'm very proud of that project. I got to be a participant in it. It was not uncontroversial at the time for a number of different reasons. And moving forward, we just saw what's now called the Inflation Reduction Act pass, and this is a good step forward in a number of ways with lots of incentives, tax credits around electric vehicles and renewable energy generation and efficiency and so on. It's not nearly enough to meet even the Biden administration's goal for emissions reductions over the course of over the next couple of decades. And it's also not enough to meet the more ambitious but imperative goals of the Paris Accords or the Green New Deal of reducing emissions down to net zero by 2050. And so it's another space where there's room for government action, and government investment would not only help to protect the environment, but would create a lot of jobs, a lot of new economic activity in the process.
Okay, when were you in office? From 2007 to 2011?
Yes.
Okay. You know, actually, before we move on to some of your other issues, you switched from the Green Party to the Democratic Party. How come?
I first got involved, as I said, as a part of these movements around organized labor and other rights. And over time, when I served on the council, I was working with Democrats. It was 14 Democrats and me, and had a very strong working relationship with my colleagues on the city council and with more and more people from across the city who were Democrats. And I realized that the Democratic Party was the best way to forward my values from that point forward, as parts of these broad coalitions around things like wages and civil rights and civil liberties and workers' rights and environmentalism. And it was just a natural sort of evolution over the course of my time in office.
Okay. Let's see, want to talk a little bit about improving healthcare access, lowering costs?
I support a Medicare for all framework, which would lower administrative costs, lower costs overall by on the order of 10% or so, depending on which study you look at. But even, for instance, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the notoriously nonpartisan entity that analyzes budgets within the federal government, Medicare for All would end up lowering costs overall across the system by about 10%, even while expanding access so that every American is covered by it, and also expanding access, so that expanding coverage that includes, for instance, dental and vision and hearing and long-term care. And so that's my preferred mechanism of both expanding access and lowering costs. I think they're both imperative things to do.
So when no more private insurance companies?
Well, I think that ideally we would get to a point where things are good enough that people don't see the need to seek private insurance anymore. And I think there are other mechanisms we also need to use to lower costs. I think that it was good that some amount of Medicare negotiation over pharmaceutical prices is incorporated into the Inflation Reduction Act. But again, we have a situation where the pharmaceutical companies have far too much power over our political system and are able to increase prices, are not always incentivized to actually be working on the medicines that people most need, because there isn't always a profit motive in taking care of folks. And we have a system where it's frequently the case that the government does the initial research into potential new medicine, then hands over that research, licenses that research to a pharmaceutical company for distribution, further production and distribution, and doesn't have guardrails around matters like access and pricing. And so, for instance, before I started doing this work, or running for this office, I was doing work around a really promising looking COVID vaccine that Walter Reed is working on. And my worry, and this is the thing I was trying to interrupt, we'll see what happens, was that this very promising, acclaimed new medicine that would deal with, and I don't know the exact mechanism, but would work relative to a whole slew of potential future variants of COVID, as it's being described, will get handed off to a private pharmaceutical company for distribution, for manufacture and distribution, without those guardrails in place in a way that will limit access to people here who need it and people across the globe who need it.
Do you know where most medications are manufactured?
Where most are manufactured?
Yeah.
I need a more specific question than that.
Medications, pills, like, do you know,
right.
are they manufactured mostly in the U.S. or overseas?
There's manufacture all across the world, but there are FDA-approved factories in various countries, including.
So what percentage are we importing versus making here? And is that something too that?
I don't see how that goes to the point that I was just making. Well, to be frank about it,
just economic development and the cost of medication. Don't you think it's more costly to import something than to have it produced here? Plus, we're creating economic opportunities for people.
Yeah, and I was speaking earlier about the need to re-examine our trade deals so that we incentivize more manufacture and production of a variety of different things in the U.S. Yeah. And we again made the decision to start allowing for outsourcing because these corporations were encouraging politicians to enter into trade deals that benefited the corporations, but not the workers and not the consumers as much.
I wonder how medical providers would be affected then if there was just one system. There's no competition to get paneled with different insurance companies because you're going to get a better rate. And then, some countries you have to wait in line to get an operation because of the universal healthcare system.
Right. So the studies that I've seen of Medicare for All show that the reduction in administrative costs and paperwork, and then you wouldn't need to deal with as aggressive malpractice insurance because future care is baked into malpractice insurance rates, and that would be something that would be paid for by the government moving forward. There are a lot of mechanisms through which costs and time taken by providers would be reduced. Also, there are well, what I was just saying. So right now, by some estimates, on the order of 20% of the time that doctors spend is on administrative work, and that's ridiculous. And the whole system is something like 30 or 40% administrative costs. Now, you have a much, much lower rate in other countries of overhead costs. And so a lot of why we achieve cost savings through Medicare for All is we're reducing administrative costs. We're also freeing up more time for doctors to do what they want to do, which is, and I've got doctors in my family who just see patients, not deal with administrative work, entering electronic medical records and so on.
But you have
so that
to.
Would,
you have to keep a record.
Right, you have to keep a record, but when you have a more streamlined system, there's a reduction in the number of different records you need to keep, the number of entities you're reporting to.
Well, as a practitioner, I don't know how that would even happen, but okay. There's something else, David, I wanted to ask you about this while we were on this topic of, I forget. We're down to 3 minutes, so let's move on. Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm. I support sensible gun control. I support the measures that were passed here 3 or 4 months ago now, and I would support porting those measures over to the federal level.
So those measures reduced capacity, right? Like how many actual bullets you can put in a magazine.
Right.
Okay. Have you ever fired a gun?
I haven't.
Okay. Do you know how long a gunfight is? Do you know how many bullets it takes to put someone down?
I'm not going to.
But if there's a threat, but this is something, But what about?
I don't think people need semi-automatic weapons on the streets.
Okay, but a semi-automatic weapon, what's the difference between that and a revolver?
That the chamber is loaded automatically. That's what makes it semi-automatic, right? So it makes it easier.
It's not loaded automatically, right?
Okay.
So the difference between an automatic weapon and a semi-automatic weapon, you have to actually pull the trigger, release, pull the trigger, release. So
right. Yeah, it's loaded automatically, but you still have to pull the trigger to fire. So I don't think that those weapons need to be in our streets. And that is my position, which I'm happy to stand by.
So are you going after criminals or law-abiding citizens who have trained and applied for a permit? And do you know what percentage of our population in Rhode Island even has a carry permit?
I support a federal assault weapons ban. So I think that we should not have assault weapons out on our streets.
We had an assault weapons ban some decades ago.
Yeah, we did. That's true. I think we should reinstitute it.
But did it work?
I think it made a difference.
How so?
I think that we have a string of mass shootings that we've seen over the course of recent decades happen again and again and again. And we've seen an increase in homicide rates over the course of the last couple of years. Again, way down relative to the peaks in the 90s, but they're back up. And police, the police chiefs across the country support reinstituting assault weapons bans because they understand that the proliferation of guns into our streets is increasing harm to civilians and to the police. And so I agree with them on this point.
But what populations do we see and what communities do we see a lot of gun violence? Look at some of the states that have open carry. Anyway, that was so nice, David. Thank you for coming. We did not get to cover a lot that we had planned on, but maybe we can have you back. All right?
Happy to do it. The primary's in 3 weeks. So
Yes,
it'll have to be
all right.
for the general
Primary's
election.
in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. I'm Darlene DeRezzo. You can find us on social media and our new Instagram account, stateofthestate.ri.